At exactly 5 in the evening, she didn't hesitate, she didn't sigh, didn't stretch, didn't make eye contact with anyone around her. She simply stood up. The chair legs scraping softly against the floor, unplugged her laptop like it was any other ordinary day, lifted her docking station with one hand, smiled politely at our sponsor's desk, and walked out of the building forever. 10 seconds, that's all it took. 10 seconds for a man who once laughed about firing contractors whenever he wanted to realize that the person holding his most critical project together was already gone and that there would be no undo button, no apology fast enough, no authority left to save him. If you've ever been made to feel temporary, replaceable, or invisible at work, this story will crawl under your skin. If you've ever swallowed disrespect because you needed stability, because you needed the paycheck, because you told yourself things would get better, then stay with me. Like the video, subscribe, and listen closely, because this revenge wasn't loud or dramatic. It was calm, controlled, and devastating in the most professional way possible. I was a contractor, which meant my existence at work always felt conditional. I wasn't brand new, but I was never permanent either. I was trusted enough to carry responsibility, but never trusted enough to be protected. I worked in engineering on a team of 10 contractors. All of us hired the same way, all of us sitting in identical desks, all of us reporting to one full-time employee we called our sponsor. He was the only one whose badge didn't expire, the only one who never worried about extension emails, the only one who spoke with confidence that came from knowing he wasn't going anywhere. Every contract we signed used that same carefully polished corporate language: expected duration of 12 months, at-will employment, subject to early termination or possible extension. Anyone who has lived the contractor life knows what that language really does. It gives you hope without giving you security. It keeps you working hard without promising anything back. It convinces you that if you just perform well enough, you'll be safe. I believed that. I really did. Somewhere along the way, without any title change or extra pay, I became the unofficial lead. People came to me with questions. I coordinated tasks, clarified requirements, handled confusion, and smoothed over mistakes before they became problems. I stayed late. I answered messages after hours. I cared far more than I was required to. I told myself it mattered. I told myself loyalty would eventually be rewarded. That belief died quietly one afternoon. The sponsor asked me to step into a conference room. His voice was calm, efficient, like he was discussing scheduling or budgets. That's when he told me 3 contractors were being let go, immediately. No warning, no notice. Today would be their last day. And then, without pausing, without even looking uncomfortable, he added something that made my stomach twist. I need you to tell them. For a moment, my mind went completely blank. Me? Another contractor. I wasn't HR. I wasn't management. I didn't approve hiring or firing, but he didn't ask. He expected me to absorb the emotional fallout so he wouldn't have to. As I walked back to my desk, my hands felt cold and detached, like they didn't belong to me. My heartbeat was loud, almost embarrassing. I kept rehearsing the words in my head, and none of them sounded real. At 4 o'clock. I sat across from them one by one. I watched their expressions change in real time. Confusion first, then fear, then that forced professionalism people use when they're trying not to panic. No notice, no transition. Just 4 hours to pack up months of work and quietly disappear. I answered questions I didn't have answers to. I smiled when I felt like crying. When it was over, I felt physically sick. That's when Daniel came over. Daniel was the kind of person companies depend on without ever admitting it. Quiet, intensely intelligent, and terrifyingly competent. He didn't talk much, but when he did, people listened. When systems broke, Daniel fixed them. When deadlines slipped, Daniel stayed late. He had that calm presence that made you feel like things were under control as long as he was around. He asked one simple question: why didn't they get any notice? So we asked the sponsor together. I will never forget his answer. He smiled. Not awkwardly, not apologetically. He smiled like he was proud, like he was explaining a clever business move. That's why we hire contractors, he said cheerfully. so we can cut them loose at a moment's notice whenever we want." Words landed heavy. The room felt smaller. He wasn't explaining policy. He was bragging. And worse, he was bragging to two contractors standing right in front of him. It felt like a warning disguised as honesty, a reminder that none of us were safe. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice, but something inside me cracked. I realized that no amount of effort or loyalty would ever protect me. The moment it became convenient, I would be gone too. Daniel didn't react emotionally. He just nodded once, calm, polite. But his eyes changed. They weren't angry, they were focused. Like someone who had just received extremely valuable information. After that day, everything continued as if nothing had happened. Meetings went on. Deadlines were discussed. Jokes were made. But the trust was gone. The illusion of stability had evaporated. Daniel kept working like nothing was wrong. He was deeply embedded in a complex project, one that lived mostly inside his head. No documentation fully explained it. No one else truly understood the connections. It had quietly become his project simply because he was the only one capable of carrying it. One afternoon, without drama, he leaned over and whispered, "I'm interviewing." I didn't tell anyone. Not management. Not HR. Not even coworkers. Because after what I'd seen, I understood something clearly. When a company reminds people they're disposable, it shouldn't be surprised when those people stop protecting its future. What our sponsor didn't realize was painfully simple. When you teach someone that loyalty means nothing, you also teach them that notice is optional. And Daniel was already deciding exactly how silent his exit would be. After Daniel whispered that he was interviewing, nothing about his behavior changed. On the surface, and that was the most unsettling part, he didn't slow down. He didn't disengage. He didn't start acting checked out the way people usually do when they've mentally left a job. If anything, he became even more precise, even more focused. Watching him was like watching someone quietly pack their bags in their mind while still perfectly performing their role in public. And once you notice that kind of calm, you can't unsee it. Days passed, then weeks. The sponsor walked around with the same careless confidence, joking in meetings, assigning work without context, assuming availability without asking. He still spoke about contractors like we were resources, not people. He still made comments about budgets and flexibility, about how easy it was to scale up or down. Every time he said things like that, I felt my jaw tighten. Every time, Daniel said nothing. I started noticing how much of the team leaned on Daniel without realizing it. Questions went to him first, problems landed on his desk, decisions were validated by his opinion, even when management pretended otherwise. The project he was working on had become so complex that even I only understood parts of it, and I was closer to it than anyone else. There were layers of logic. Assumptions built on previous assumptions, fixes stacked on top of old fixes. Daniel carried all of it in his head, effortlessly, like a map no one else had access to, and management had no idea. They saw output. They saw progress bars moving. They saw green check marks on reports. What they didn't see was how fragile everything actually was, how much of that progress depended on one person quietly making judgment calls every single day. The sponsor treated that dependency like a given, like gravity. He assumed it would always be there. Daniel kept interviewing quietly. He didn't broadcast it. He didn't fish for counteroffers. He didn't threaten to leave. He just explored his options with the same calm professionalism he applied to everything else. When he got the offer, he told me first. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He just stated it like a fact. Better pay, better title, full-time, stability, respect. They want me to start in a few weeks, he said. I remember looking at him and feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief for him, because he deserved better. Dread because I knew exactly what this would mean for the team, for the project, for the sponsor who had so casually bragged about cutting people loose. I asked him if he was going to give notice. He paused, just for a second, then he said, "I'm thinking about it." That answer sat with me for days. During that time, the sponsor doubled down on his arrogance without realizing it. In meetings, he talked about timelines like they were flexible only. In one direction, tighter. He volunteered our team for additional responsibilities without consulting us. He made jokes about how contractors should be grateful for the opportunity. Every comment reinforced the same message: you are here because we allow it. You are useful until you're not. Daniel absorbed all of it silently. He kept working. He kept committing code. He kept solving problems that no one else even noticed existed. He didn't document more than he was required to. He didn't train anyone else on the deeper parts of the system. Not maliciously, just efficiently. He wasn't obligated to protect them from their own decisions. I started to realize something uncomfortable about myself during that period. I was still overextending, still protecting timelines, still translating chaos into clarity for management. Even after everything, I was still acting like loyalty might matter. Watching Daniel made me question that instinct. He wasn't angry. He wasn't bitter. He had simply adjusted his behavior to match reality. The closer his start date got, the calmer he became. The sponsor, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware. He scheduled future milestones assuming Daniel's availability. He referenced Daniel's work as if it were guaranteed. He spoke about long-term plans that depended entirely on someone he had openly described as disposable. The irony was painful. The last week arrived quietly. Daniel didn't count down the days. He didn't hint. He didn't clear his calendar. He continued attending meetings, contributing ideas, and accepting tasks like nothing was different. If anything, his professionalism made the eventual outcome even more devastating. On his final day, the atmosphere felt normal. Too normal. There were no farewell lunches, no speeches, no transition plans. Management didn't know they needed them. The sponsor assigned Daniel a task that afternoon that assumed weeks of future work. Daniel nodded, took notes, asked clarifying questions. I remember watching that interaction and feeling a tight knot form in my chest. 5 o'clock approached slowly. At exactly 5, Daniel stood up. No announcement. No clearing of his throat. He unplugged his laptop, picked up his mouse, lifted his docking station, walked calmly to the sponsor's desk and set everything down neatly. Then he smiled, polite, professional, almost warm, and said, "Hey, thanks for everything. Today's my last day." The sponsor blinked, confused. "Wait. You're leaving?" "Yes," Daniel said. "Thanks." And then he walked out. No argument, no negotiation, no explanation, no handoff. Just 10 seconds of perfectly executed silence. The silence that followed Daniel walking out wasn't normal. It wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that only exists when something irreversible has already happened and the mind hasn't caught up yet. Our sponsor just stood there for a few seconds, staring at the empty space where Daniel had been standing moments ago. Like he expected him to turn around and say it was a misunderstanding or a joke. But the elevator doors had already closed. Daniel was gone. And the system he'd been holding together began collapsing quietly, piece by piece. At first, the sponsor looked confused rather than alarmed. He glanced at me, then back at Daniel's empty desk, then back at me again. "What did he mean by that?" he asked, genuinely puzzled, as if I might translate it into something less threatening. I shrugged. Inside, I didn't feel shock or anger. I felt clarity. This wasn't sudden. This was earned. Within minutes, his phone started ringing. The first call came from a senior stakeholder asking about progress on the project Daniel had been leading. The sponsor answered confidently, automatically, "Yes, everything's on track." Even then, he hadn't realized that everything no longer existed in the way he thought it did. He hung up and walked over to Daniel's desk, opening drawers, checking monitors, touching things like physical proximity might bring control back. Then came the emails. Messages asking for updates, questions about timelines, requests for clarification. The sponsor forwarded one to me and asked if I could just take a look at Daniel's work. I opened the files. I scrolled, and my stomach dropped. What Daniel had built wasn't messy, but it was deeply personal logic. Assumptions layered on experience, decisions based on intuition earned over months. You couldn't just step into it. You had to live inside it to understand it. By the end of the day, denial turned into irritation. The sponsor tried calling Daniel, straight to voicemail. He emailed, no response. He slacked, nothing. I watched him pace, frustration creeping into his movements, irritation into his voice. "This is unprofessional," he muttered, as if professionalism had only ever been a one-way expectation. The next morning was worse. Meetings that should have been routine turned tense. Stakeholders asked deeper questions. The sponsor deflected, promised follow-ups, claimed things were being reviewed. He pulled me into a side room and asked me how long it would take to get fully up to speed on Daniel's work. I told him the truth. Weeks, maybe longer. His face tightened. He didn't like honesty when it came with consequences. By midweek, panic replaced arrogance. The sponsor stopped joking. He stopped making casual comments about flexibility. He stayed late. He asked questions he should have asked months earlier. He finally realized how dependent everything had been on someone he'd openly described as disposable. The cruel irony was impossible to ignore. If Daniel had been a full-time employee, there would have been notice, there would have been transition meetings, there would have been documentation time. But contractors, as we'd been told so proudly, could be cut loose at any moment. Apparently, they could leave that way too. The project stalled, deadlines slipped, problems surfaced that no one knew how to solve. Things Daniel had quietly handled for months began breaking loudly. Every fix created two new issues. Every attempt to just figure it out made things worse. A week later, the sponsor called a meeting. His tone was different now, tight, controlled. He talked about unexpected challenges and resource gaps. He never said Daniel's name, but everyone felt it hanging in the air. I sat there listening, remembering the smile on his face when he'd said contractors could be cut loose anytime. Remembering how proud he'd sounded. It took almost a month to stabilize the project again. And even then, it was never quite the same. The momentum was gone. The confidence was gone. The illusion that contractors were interchangeable was completely shattered. What stayed with me most wasn't the chaos, it was the realization. The sponsor hadn't been betrayed. He had been educated, taught the same lesson he'd taught us. That loyalty without respect is foolish, that power cuts both ways, and that when you treat people like they're temporary, you shouldn't be surprised when they leave you with permanent consequences. By the second week after Daniel left, the office no longer felt like the same place. The energy had changed in a way that was impossible to ignore. Conversations were quieter. Laughter felt forced. People hesitated before answering questions, afraid of being wrong. The sponsor, who used to move through the office with relaxed authority, now walked faster, shoulders tight, eyes constantly scanning screens and calendars like he was chasing time itself. He had lost control, and everyone could feel it. The project Daniel had been leading became the center of everything. Meetings were called and canceled, then called again. New contractors were brought in, smart people with impressive resumes, but they struggled immediately. They asked questions that Daniel had already answered months ago. They made assumptions that caused things to break. They underestimated the complexity because they hadn't lived inside it. I watched them stumble through work Daniel had once handled effortlessly, and for the first time, management saw what quiet competence actually looks like when it's gone. The sponsor started asking me questions differently now. Not like instructions, like requests. He wanted reassurance I couldn't honestly give. "You're close to this, right?" he'd say. "You understand most of it." I would answer carefully, truthfully. "I understand parts of it." Each time I said that, his face tightened just a little more. He was realizing how much he'd never bothered to learn, how much he'd delegated without understanding, how dangerous his assumptions had been. What struck me most was how often Daniel's name almost came up in conversation, only to be swallowed at the last second. The sponsor never criticized him out loud. He couldn't. Deep down, he knew there was nothing to criticize. Daniel hadn't broken any rules. He hadn't been rude. He hadn't caused a scene. He had simply exercised the exact same flexibility the company had bragged about having. The sponsor had created the rules. Daniel had just followed them to their logical conclusion. Deadlines slipped publicly now. Stakeholders noticed. Questions escalated upward. The sponsor had to explain delays without pointing fingers because the truth made him look reckless. Each explanation sounded thinner than the last: an anticipated turnover, knowledge concentration, process gaps, corporate language trying desperately to cover personal failure. I noticed something else too. The sponsor stopped making jokes about contractors completely. The casual arrogance was gone. In its place was caution, even discomfort. He had learned the hard way that the people he considered temporary were the ones carrying permanent consequences. That realization didn't make him kinder, but it made him quieter. Power looks very different when it's been challenged without confrontation. About a month after Daniel left, I overheard the sponsor on a call, voice low, almost strained. He was explaining why the project needed more time, more money, more support. He sounded defensive, smaller. It hit me then that this wasn't just about missed deadlines or broken systems. This was about reputation, trust, the invisible currency managers trade in when no one's looking. Daniel hadn't just disrupted a project, he had exposed a leadership failure. I thought back to the day those 3 contractors were let go with no notice. How quickly it had happened, how casually, how proud the sponsor had seemed of that power. By the second week after Daniel left, the office no longer felt like the same place. The energy had changed in a way that was impossible to ignore. Conversations were quieter. Laughter felt forced. People hesitated before answering questions, afraid of being wrong. The sponsor, who used to move through the office with relaxed authority, now walked faster, shoulders tight, eyes constantly scanning screens and calendars like he was chasing time itself. He had lost control, and everyone could feel it. The project Daniel had been leading became the center of everything. Meetings were called and canceled, then called again. New contractors were brought in, smart people with impressive resumes, but they struggled immediately. They asked questions that Daniel had already answered months ago. They made assumptions that caused things to break. They underestimated the complexity because they hadn't lived inside it. I watched them stumble through work Daniel had once handled effortlessly, and for the first time, management saw what quiet competence actually looks like when it's gone. The sponsor started asking me questions differently now. Not like instructions, like requests. He wanted reassurance I couldn't honestly give. "You're close to this, right?" he'd say. "You understand most of it." I would answer carefully, truthfully. "I understand parts of it." Each time I said that, his face tightened just a little more. He was realizing how much he'd never bothered to learn, how much he'd delegated without understanding, how dangerous his assumptions had been. What struck me most was how often Daniel's name almost came up in conversation, only to be swallowed at the last second. The sponsor never criticized him out loud. He couldn't. Deep down, he knew there was nothing to criticize. Daniel hadn't broken any rules. He hadn't been rude. He hadn't caused a scene. He had simply exercised the exact same flexibility the company had bragged about having. The sponsor had created the rules. Daniel had just followed them to their logical conclusion. Deadlines slipped publicly now. Stakeholders noticed. Questions escalated upward. The sponsor had to explain delays without pointing fingers because the truth made him look reckless. Each explanation sounded thinner than the last: an anticipated turnover, knowledge concentration, process gaps, corporate language trying desperately to cover personal failure. I noticed something else too. The sponsor stopped making jokes about contractors completely. The casual arrogance was gone. In its place was caution, even discomfort. He had learned the hard way that the people he considered temporary were the ones carrying permanent consequences. That realization didn't make him kinder, but it made him quieter. Power looks very different when it's been challenged without confrontation. About a month after Daniel left, I overheard the sponsor on a call, voice low, almost strained. He was explaining why the project needed more time, more money, more support. He sounded defensive, smaller. It hit me then that this wasn't just about missed deadlines or broken systems. This was about reputation, trust, the invisible currency managers trade in when no one's looking. Daniel hadn't just disrupted a project. He had exposed a leadership failure. I thought back to the day those 3 contractors were let go with no notice. How quickly it had happened. How casually. How proud the sponsor had seemed of that power. Now I watched him deal with the other side of that philosophy, and the symmetry was impossible to ignore. There was no shouting, no confrontation, just consequences unfolding slowly, relentlessly, without mercy. By the time everything finally stabilized, it had been almost 2 months since Daniel walked out. On paper, the project was back on track. New processes had been added. Extra documentation was forced into existence. Another contractor had been assigned to slowly untangle what Daniel once held effortlessly in his head. From the outside, it probably looked like the company had survived just fine. But anyone who was actually there knew the truth. What had been lost wasn't just time or money. It was certainty. It was confidence. It was the illusion that authority automatically equals control. The sponsor never said Daniel's name again. Not once. But I saw it in the way he paused before speaking now, in the way he hesitated before making absolute statements. He no longer joked about flexibility. He no longer bragged about cutting people loose. Every time a contractor asked a question, he answered more carefully, more politely, as if he'd finally realized that the people sitting in front of him weren't just placeholders. They were leverage, quiet leverage, the most dangerous kind. What stayed with me wasn't the chaos or the stress or even the satisfaction of watching arrogance collapse under its own weight. What stayed with me was how simple the revenge had been. There were no threats, no ultimatums, no dramatic confrontations. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't burn bridges. He didn't even explain himself. He simply mirrored the rules he'd been given, at will, no notice required, flexibility, and in doing so, he exposed how one-sided those rules had always been. I thought a lot about the day those 3 contractors were fired, how fast it happened, how casually it was handled. How powerless they must have felt walking out with cardboard boxes while everyone else kept working. At the time, management had framed it as efficiency, as business, as nothing personal. But watching Daniel leave made one thing painfully clear. When people say it's just business, what they usually mean is it's convenient for me. And convenience disappears the moment power shifts. Something changed in me after that. I stopped volunteering for unpaid responsibility. I stopped acting like loyalty would protect me. I did my job well, professionally, but I no longer confused effort with safety. I no longer believed that being indispensable meant being valued. Daniel had been indispensable, and it hadn't saved him. What saved him was knowing his worth and knowing when to leave. Months later, I ran into one of the contractors who'd been fired that day. He'd landed somewhere better pay, better leadership, better boundaries. We talked briefly, and I didn't tell him about Daniel, but I thought about how the company lost people who could have stayed, who would have stayed, if they'd just been treated with basic respect. That was the real cost, not the missed deadlines, not the escalations, the loss of trust that never comes back once it's broken. The sponsor eventually moved on to another role, higher up, on paper. It looked like a promotion, but I knew better. His reputation had been quietly marked. He was known now as someone who lost control of a critical project, someone who underestimated his team, someone who learned a very expensive lesson the hard way. In corporate environments, those things follow you even when no one says them out loud. Daniel, on the other hand, thrived. He sent me a message months later. He was happy, respected, trusted. His new team listened to him. His manager actually asked questions instead of making assumptions. He never once expressed regret about how he left. Not because he was heartless, but because he was honest. He'd given the company exactly what they said contractors were worth. And that's the part people don't talk about enough. Revenge doesn't always look like destruction. Sometimes it looks like alignment. Like matching energy. Like refusing to give more than what's offered. Daniel didn't take anything from them. He simply stopped giving. Looking back, the most satisfying part wasn't watching the sponsor panic or scramble or lose sleep. It was watching the balance correct itself. Watching someone who believed power only flowed downward realize that it doesn't. It flows both ways. Always has, always will. If there's one lesson I took from all of this, it's this. Never confuse access with authority. Never confuse a title with importance. And never assume the people you treat as temporary won't leave you with permanent consequences. Daniel didn't seek revenge. He didn't need to. He just walked away at the exact moment it mattered most, and sometimes, that's the most powerful statement you can make. So if you're listening to this and you're in a job where you feel invisible, disposable, or constantly reminded that you should be grateful just to be there, remember this story. Remember that you don't owe loyalty to disrespect. You don't owe notice to people who brag about denying it, and you don't need to burn the building down to make your point. Sometimes, all you have to do is stand up, unplug your laptop, and leave. If this story hit you, if it reminded you of a moment where you wished you'd walked away sooner, or stood up for yourself quietly, then do me a favor, hit that like button. Subscribe for more real stories like this, and tell me in the comments, what's the most satisfying, quiet revenge you've ever witnessed at work? Because trust me, the quiet ones are always the loudest in the end.